The Complete History of Colonization of America. The Fall of Tenochtitlan. The city was still smoldering when the last king was dragged through streets cracked and broken. Stone temples lay in ruin. Canals, once sparkling veins through the city, ran dark and still. The air carried the smell of smoke and fear. Thousands had died, not from swords or battle, but from a silent killer that came before the soldiers arrived. A disease that Europeans carried unknowingly. Smallpox. In the year 1521, one of the greatest cities on earth fell. Tenochtitlan, richer and larger than any European city, was gone, and in its place stood a handful of men in metal armor, strangers in a strange land, staring at what they had wrought. They were not supposed to win. Outnumbered, far from home, and facing the unknown, they had accomplished the impossible. But what happened next would change the world forever. Because the Real story was not just the fall of an empire. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would erase entire civilizations from history. The America before Europe. Long before ships cut through the Atlantic, America was alive. Forests stretched beyond imagination. Rivers flowed like silver ribbons through vast landscapes. Cities rose from jungles and plains, built by millions of people living, working, praying, trading, and dreaming. They had laws. They had science. They had maps of the stars. They had history. But Europe did not see a world full of civilization. Europe saw opportunity. In the late 1400s, Europe was hungry. Kings sought gold. Churches sought power. Merchants sought new trade routes. Ancient roads to Asia were blocked, and the world felt too small. So they looked west. Not for courage, not for curiosity, but for survival and wealth. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed into the unknown. He did not know where he was going. He did not know what he would find. And he did not care who already lived there. When he arrived in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached Asia. He was wrong. The people he met were not Indians. They were the Taino. Peaceful, curious, and generous. They welcomed him and shared their knowledge and food. Columbus described them as kind. He described them as gentle. But he also saw opportunity. He wrote that they could become servants. That thought would echo through centuries. The consequences of contact. Columbus returned on a second voyage with soldiers, horses, dogs, and chains. The welcome was no longer smiles, it was fear. Villages were burned. Gold was demanded. Punishments followed when demands could not be met. Within 50 years, the Taino were nearly gone. Not vanished. Destroyed. Europe called it progress. Word spread fast. Spain, Portugal, England, France, they all wanted a new world. A world full of land, untouched resources, and wealth to claim. Maps were drawn before feet touched the soil. Borders were claimed with ink and seals. And the people already living there were not invited. Then came the conquistadors, men like Hernán Cortés. Cortés burned his own ships upon arrival, telling his men there was no turning back. He would move forward, using local alliances, fear, steel, and disease to achieve his goals. The Aztec Empire watched him arrive. They had seen signs, strange stars, rumors of pale men arriving from the sea. Their ruler, Moctezuma, hesitated. That pause proved fatal. Smallpox had already spread, weakening the population. When the final attack came, the empire was already on its knees. Civilization beyond the Aztecs. The story did not end in Mexico. Across North America, other civilizations had risen and fallen long before Europeans arrived. The Mississippian cities, like Cahokia, built massive earth mounds and established trade networks stretching thousands of miles. Knowledge, art, and history were passed through generations. When Europeans arrived, they did not see civilization. They saw opportunity. In 1607, Jamestown was founded on swampy ground. The settlers were not farmers. They were gentlemen unprepared for survival. They were saved by the Powhatan Confederacy, who taught them planting and survival skills. For a brief moment, there was peace. Then hunger, fear, and the desire for land led to conflict. Trust broke. Wars followed. In New England, pilgrims arrived, struggling through harsh winters. Native tribes helped them survive. That moment is remembered as Thanksgiving. Yet the rest of the story, the loss of villages, land, and culture, is rarely told. Within decades, Native communities were reduced by disease, displacement, and conflict. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of Native Americans died after contact with Europeans. Colonization and its consequences. As colonies grew, a darker chapter unfolded. When native labor declined due to death and escape, Europeans turned to Africa. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying enslaved humans. Cities grew. Wealth flowed outward. Pain remained behind. Colonization was not just about land. It was about control. Control of bodies, control of stories, and control of history. Native nations were pushed west. Treaties were signed and broken. Children sent to schools where their language and culture were suppressed. Gold discoveries fueled greed. Laws and borders replaced chains, but the harm remained. The Trail of Tears was not a journey. It was a forced march of displacement. Families and communities were uprooted. Culture and tradition were disrupted. Yet, a narrative of destiny, manifest destiny, painted the expansion as both inevitable and holy. A hidden history. By the time America became a nation, the damage was deep. The voices of the first people were fading but not gone. Buried under cities, hidden in records, whispered through songs, a secret history remained. A history rarely taught in textbooks. A history erased on purpose. Colonization never truly ended. It changed form. Borders replaced chains. Laws replaced weapons. Memory replaced truth. And somewhere, in lost letters, burned villages, and forgotten languages, one question remains. What was taken that can never be returned? Because when the first maps were drawn, a detail was intentionally erased. A detail so powerful it could reshape everything we think we know about the birth of America. The map itself, the map was small, yellowed, cracked, drawn by hand. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just a relic of a forgotten age. But this map did not show empty land. It showed cities, hundreds of them, rivers, carefully named, that Europeans later claimed had never been traveled, roads, worn deep through forests that Europe would call untouched, symbols for towns and villages that, according to the story we were taught, should not have existed. And then, someone had scratched most of it out, not by accident, not by time, but by choice. This was a map created not by outsiders, but by the people who lived on the land. Long before crowns and flags, they had drawn, remembered, and recorded their world. And what they mapped was not about ownership in the European sense. It was about memory. Rivers were remembered as stories. Mountains were honored as ancestors. Paths were agreements between nations, a language of relationships and history. Europeans, when they arrived, could not understand this. Or perhaps, they understood it too well. Reports from early explorers. Early explorers wrote something striking in their journals. This land is far more populated than expected. Spanish priests described cities larger than Madrid. French traders wrote of endless towns along the Mississippi. English settlers reported roads worn into the ground, leading far inland. Yet when reports were sent back to Europe, something changed. The cities became villages. The nations became tribes. Populations became scattered. A lie was forming. Empty land is easier to claim, easier to take. European powers were in a race. Spain, France, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, whoever claimed first, gained wealth, power, and glory. But there was a problem. International law, even in the 1500s and 1600s, recognized ownership. Land already occupied could not simply be taken. The solution? Erase the owners. Not just with weapons, but with words. Maps printed in Europe slowly removed native cities. Names were replaced. Rivers were renamed after kings who had never seen them. Mountains were claimed by men who had never climbed them. And once the land looked empty on paper, it was legally declared empty. The term was terra nullius, land belonging to no one. One of the most powerful lies ever told. Land and belief. As colonies expanded, settlers pushed inland, cutting forests and fencing the land into squares. To native nations, land could not be owned like this. You could belong to land, but you could not cage it. This difference in belief became a weapon. Treaties were written in English legal language. Native leaders often thought they were agreeing to share land, not sell it forever. When settlers refused to leave, misunderstanding turned to conflict. One of the deadliest examples was King Philip's War in the 1670s. Entire regions of New England erupted in violence. Villages burned. Towns vanished. By the end, native resistance in the region had been broken. Survivors were displaced, enslaved, or erased from records. Colonial growth carried a cost. As land was taken, fear spread. Fear of rebellion, fear of revenge, fear of people who remembered what had been stolen. Laws followed. Native people were banned from owning land in many areas. Alcohol and missionaries were used to weaken communities. Children were taken from families, sent to schools far away, given new names, and punished for speaking their language. The goal was not education. The goal was erasure. The birth of a nation on stolen land. By the 1700s, European settlers began calling themselves Americans. No longer just colonies, they wanted a nation. But this nation was built on land taken through broken promises. When the American Revolution began, native nations were trapped between two forces: support the British, who had betrayed them before, or the colonists, already taking land. There was no safe choice. After independence, the new United States promised peace and respect. Promises were made and broken. Treaties were signed and violated. Each discovery of gold, each fertile valley, pushed boundaries further west. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the country overnight, without asking a single native nation. Explorers like Lewis and Clark were sent to map the land. They were guided by native knowledge, fed by native villages, and repeatedly saved by the people who had lived there for centuries. Their reports were clear: the land was full. Yet the official story told the opposite. On paper, it was wilderness, empty, waiting. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. As settlers poured west, pressure built. What followed was policy, not accident. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed. The law was polite on paper, calm in tone, but enforced in practice, it was brutal. Entire nations were forced from their homes. Families marched west at gunpoint. Resistance was punished. The Cherokee had adopted American laws. They built farms, printed newspapers, even won a case in the Supreme Court. Yet it did not matter. They were removed. The Trail of Tears left thousands dead, bodies buried along the road, names lost, stories erased. Land was quickly resold, maps redrawn, and textbooks moved on. The frontier was closed, the past presented as past. But something important happened quietly: archaeology and the overwritten history. As the West was settled, archaeologists began finding ruins, large mounds, stone cities, and roads older than Europe's. But rather than rewriting history, many discoveries were ignored or explained away. Some were attributed to lost races. Others were left unstudied. Acknowledging them would challenge the national story. America had not been discovered, it had been overwritten. In the early 1900s, a government report mentioned an ancient network of cities stretching across North America, far older and more advanced than previously believed. That report vanished. The man who tried to publish it lost his position almost immediately. What he discovered challenged everything. Because the land was never empty. The cities were real. The networks were real. And the maps that survived, though erased and rewritten, quietly preserved a truth that could no longer be ignored. Hidden, ignored, waiting, proof that America was never empty, only overwritten. And in the next chapter, we uncover the moment when America almost told the truth before it was silenced. The hidden past emerges, the truth almost escaped. Not on a battlefield, not during a revolution, but in quiet rooms filled with paper, dust, and fear. It was the early 1900s. America was celebrating progress. Railroads stretched across the continent. Cities rose quickly. Factories roared. The nation told itself a story: brave settlers, empty land, destiny fulfilled. But beneath the ground, the past was pushing back. Farmers across the Midwest, while plowing their fields, began to find objects that hinted at a long-forgotten history. Bones arranged in careful lines. Walls buried under layers of soil. Tools, ornaments, and artifacts that pointed to organized societies. Mounds shaped like animals, stars, and symbols no longer understood. Newspapers reported these discoveries with excitement. Ancient city found in Ohio, giant earthworks discovered in Illinois, proof of early civilization in America? Questions arose. Who built these structures? When? Why hadn't we known? And those questions scared the wrong people. Because if America had ancient, sophisticated civilizations, the story of a wild, empty land, the justification for settlement and expansion, collapsed. The Smithsonian and the buried reports. At the center of this emerging mystery was one of America's most trusted institutions, the Smithsonian. In 1902, a researcher working inside the Smithsonian compiled reports from across the country. His files described vast urban centers predating European contact, trade networks stretching thousands of miles, evidence that native nations were heirs to advanced societies, not scattered, primitive tribes. He believed the American public deserved to know. He prepared to publish his findings. And then, everything stopped. Funding was cut. Access was revoked. The reports were classified. The researcher was reassigned. Officially, the findings were called misinterpretations. Unofficially, the message was clear: this story will not be told. Soon, a new narrative replaced the old discoveries, the mound builder myth. It claimed the mounds and earthworks were built by a mysterious race that vanished long before Native Americans arrived. This narrative served two purposes. It erased Native achievements, and it erased Native ownership. Because if the land was built by someone else, it was legally unclaimed. The myth spread quickly. Textbooks adopted it. Museums repeated it. Schools taught it. Even as Native elders spoke, insisting these were their ancestors, their voices were largely ignored. Reservations and boarding schools. At the same time, the government implemented a final solution to what it called the Indian problem. Reservations. Small parcels of land, often barren, far from resources, promised to native nations forever. But forever was fragile. Oil, gold, or fertile soil shifted borders almost immediately. Children were still taken from families, sent to boarding schools, where hair was cut, clothes replaced, and names changed. Teachers insisted this was for their own good, to civilize them. But the children knew better. Many never returned home. Some were buried at the schools, their graves unmarked. By the early 20th century, the colonization of land was nearly complete. But colonization of memory, the shaping of what Americans knew or believed about history, was only beginning. Movies portrayed cowboys and settlers. Books celebrated frontier life. Native people were shown in the past, never the present. A people erased twice, first by force and then by forgetting. The cracks began to show. Then came World War I. The Great Depression, World War II. America became a global power, and power prefers clean stories. But cracks began to show. In the 1960s and 70s, Native activists rose. They occupied Alcatraz. They marched. They demanded treaty rights. They asked a simple question: if this land was taken illegally, what now? The government responded slowly. Some land was returned. Some apologies were made. Some promises repeated. Yet something was still missing: the truth about the beginning. Deep inside archives, reports still sat unread. Artifacts remained locked away. Mounds were flattened for highways and urban development. Every time a discovery threatened the old story, it disappeared into silence. And over decades, silence became tradition. A discovery that could not be ignored. Then, in the late 20th century, construction workers in a major American city uncovered a buried settlement far older than expected. Carbon dating shocked the experts. This site was not thousands of years old. It was far older. It proved continuous civilization on the land, far beyond what textbooks allowed. For a brief moment, the truth was impossible to ignore. Then the site was sealed. Access was restricted. Findings were delayed indefinitely. The official reason: further study. But those working there noticed unusual precautions. Guards increased. Phones near the site stopped working. Researchers were instructed not to speak to the press. One archaeologist leaked a message: if this goes public, everything changes. And then he disappeared from the project. No interviews. No papers. No explanation. Replacement, not erasure. What was found threatened the foundation of American identity. It proved that colonization was not simply conquest. It was replacement. A new society built directly on top of an older one. And the older one had never truly disappeared. It had been buried, overwritten, silenced. But it remained, hidden beneath cities, roads, and schools, quietly waiting to be acknowledged. The fight over history is ongoing. The struggle over truth is still happening today. In the next chapter, we follow the power, money, and modern consequences of this buried history, and why the past America tried to hide continues to shape the present. The restless ground. Money does not like questions. Power hates them. And history, when it threatens both, gets rewritten. By the late 1900s, America looked finished. Borders were drawn. Cities reached for the sky. Progress seemed complete. But beneath highways and skyscrapers, the ground remained restless. History does not stay buried forever. When oil and natural resources were discovered on native lands, companies arrived almost overnight. Contracts were signed in rooms where native voices were few. Fine print replaced gunfire. Lawyers replaced soldiers. This was a new form of colonization. Quiet, legal, polite, and just as effective. Some native nations became wealthy from energy production. Others watched sacred lands transformed, poisoned, or disturbed. Graves were built over. Archaeological sites drilled through. When communities protested, they were labeled obstacles to progress. The old pattern repeated itself: land first, people last. Museums and the displayed past. At the same time, museums across the country filled with native artifacts: bones, masks, tools, clothing, and sacred objects. Many were taken without permission. Some were excavated from burial grounds. Others were donated in times when refusing was not an option. These objects were labeled, cataloged, and placed behind glass. The past was put on display, but the people connected to it were kept outside. For decades, native nations requested the return of their ancestors' remains and sacred objects. They asked for proper burials, for items to come home. The answer was almost always no. In 1990, the United States passed a law requiring museums to return human remains and sacred objects to native tribes. This was called progress. Yet, even as the law took effect, complications arose. Museums claimed they did not know the origins of certain remains. Records were missing. Some argued the items were too old to belong to modern tribes. The same pattern appeared again: erase the connection, erase the claim. Science, law, and identity. In one notable case, ancient remains were found near a river. Scientists wanted to study them. Local native nations insisted these were their ancestors and must be buried. The court battle lasted for years. Science versus identity. Study versus respect. Control versus memory. The bones stayed locked away. Because whoever controls the past controls the story. And whoever controls the story controls land, identity, and power. Meanwhile, schools continued teaching simplified versions of history. Colonization was framed as rough but necessary. Native people appeared at the beginning of the textbook and vanished by the middle. Children grew up believing the story was finished. But it was not. Modern struggles and questions. Across America, native communities continued fighting. For clean water, for voting rights, for recognition, and for land promised in treaties. Treaties that remained legally valid, but politically ignored. Every struggle came back to the same question: who was here first? And who gets to decide what that means? In the digital age, the cracks widened. Old documents were scanned. Letters resurfaced. Maps once locked away appeared online. Native scholars began publishing their own histories. Elders recorded stories passed down for centuries. Archaeologists worked alongside tribes rather than around them. Slowly, painfully, the story began to change. But with change came resistance. Statues were questioned, and outrage followed. Land acknowledgments were made, and mockery followed. Textbooks were updated, and funding was threatened. For many, admitting the truth felt like losing pride, innocence, or control. Unmarked graves and the power of silence. The truth does not care about comfort. It waits, and then it returns. In recent years, unmarked graves were discovered at former boarding schools. Ground-penetrating radar revealed rows of children buried without names. The news shocked the world. But native communities were not surprised. They had been saying it for generations. The silence was never ignorance. It was choice. A deliberate shaping of history and memory to protect power, avoid accountability, and preserve a narrative convenient to those in control. The colonization of America was not a single event in the past. It was a process, a system, a story told over and over until it felt normal. But every system leaves evidence. Every lie leaves cracks. And now, the past is speaking louder than ever. Who decides the future? The question is no longer what happened. It is, what happens next? Once a nation confronts the truth about its beginnings, it must decide who it wants to be. Colonization did not just take land. It shaped the future. It reshaped memory, identity, and the very story a nation tells about itself. Today, those decisions continue. Statues are removed. Textbooks rewritten. Archives reopened. Stories once silenced are being told. The shadow of the past is long, but awareness is growing. The conversation is no longer just about history. It is about justice, respect, and the future. The people who lived here first, and their descendants, are reclaiming not only what was taken, but also the right to define the story of the land. Because history is not just what happened. History is power, and power belongs to those who choose to acknowledge it. The past that never disappeared, the past did not disappear. It learned how to hide. When people say colonization is over, they imagine ships sailing away, wars ending, pages turning. They imagine a clean break between then and now. But colonization did not end. It changed its clothes. Today, cities stand where villages once stood. Roads cut through ancient paths. Farms cover land that holds generations of history. Rivers still flow, but many carry the consequences of centuries of exploitation. The systems built hundreds of years ago are still at work. Just quietly, the borders drawn by colonizers became states. The laws written to control land became modern property law. The ideas once used to justify conquest became lessons in schools, stories in books, and images in movies. The story was repeated so many times that it felt natural, normal, invisible. But shadows only exist when something blocks the light. And the light has been growing. Revival of culture and language. Across America, native nations are reclaiming what was nearly lost. Language programs teach children words that were once beaten out of their grandparents. Songs return. Ceremonies continue, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, sometimes in defiance of centuries of suppression. The people who were supposed to vanish are still here. The presence of this culture is proof that colonization, while powerful, cannot erase identity completely. Knowledge, stories, and traditions are resilient. They persist, even when the world seems determined to ignore them. At the same time, the ongoing consequences of colonization remain visible. Communities displaced onto poor-quality land face higher rates of disease. Water sources are unsafe. Life expectancy is lower. Promises are still broken. These are not accidents. They are echoes, reminders of choices made generations ago. Modern colonization in disguise. Colonization is not just a story of the past. It continues today. When pipelines cross treaty land, it is colonization. When corporations extract wealth and leave lasting damage, it is colonization. When history is softened in textbooks, museums, and public spaces to avoid discomfort, it is colonization. Colonization is not only about land. It is about whose voice matters, whose pain is counted, whose story is believed. In recent years, more Americans have begun to ask hard questions. Why are treaties still not honored? Why are Native communities underfunded? Why were we never taught this history? And the answers always lead back to the beginning. A beginning built on taking, not sharing, on erasing, not listening, on power, not truth. The weight of silence. Some fear that telling the full story will tear the country apart. But history shows the opposite. Silence is what rots nations from the inside. Truth is what gives them a chance to heal. Colonization of America was not the story of brave discovery. It was the story of a meeting between worlds, between choices, between greed and respect. One path was taken, and its effects are still with us today. The land remembers. The people remember. The memory of the past persists in countless ways. The unfinished story. The question now is not whether the past matters. It is whether we are brave enough to face it. The complete history of colonization in America is not finished. It is still being written. And for the first time in a very long time, the ending is not decided yet. The story belongs to everyone who engages with it honestly. Every decision made today, every acknowledgement of truth, every act of restoration shapes the future. Because the past never truly leaves. It waits. It challenges. It teaches. And it offers a chance to rebuild a story based not on silence, but on justice, respect, and shared memory.